Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We're continuing our Wayside School is Falling Down series. We're at chapter 16, Love and a Dead Rat. Damon was in love with one of the girls in his class. Can you guess which one? He thought about her all the time. Myron threw a red ball to Damon, and it bounced off his face. Huh? Said Damon. Why didn't you catch the ball? Asked Myron. What ball? Asked Damon. The one that hit you in the face, said Myron. Did a ball hit me in the face? Asked Damon. Yes, said Myron. Oh, good, said Damon. I was wondering why my nose was hurting me. He had been thinking about the girl he loved. He was in love with Mrs. Jules. That was why he was always doing things for her, like passing out papers. He thought she was very pretty and nice, and he thought she was smart too. In fact, he thought she was one of the smartest people in the class. After recess, he hurried back up the stairs. Hello, Damon, said Mrs. Jules. Hello, Mrs. Jules, said Damon. You're always the first one to come here, aren't you? Asked Mrs. Jules. Damon blushed and shrugged his shoulders. Do you need any papers passed out or anything? He asked. That's so nice of you to ask, said Mrs. Jules. I think you're nice too, said Damon. Mrs. Jules gave him a stack of workbooks to hand out. Then she gave him a Tootsie Roll Pop from the coffee can on her desk for being so helpful. But don't eat it until after lunch, she said. I won't, he assured her. He ate lunch with Myron and a DJ. He saved his Tootsie Roll Pop for last. Joy and Mauricia came up behind him. Hi, Damon, said Joy. How's your girlfriend? What? Asked Damon. He turned red. What are you talking about? I don't have a girlfriend. You're in love with Mrs. Jules, accused Mauricia. You better watch out, said Joy. Mr. Jules might come after you. The two girls started to laugh. I don't know what you're talking about, said Damon. I'm not in love with Mrs. Jules. He looked to his friends for support. Myron shrugged. DJ smiled. Prove it, said Joy. Prove you're not in love with her. That's stupid, said Damon. How can I prove I'm not in love with Mrs. Jules? Give her this, said Joy, and she handed Damon a paper bag. Your lunch? Asked Damon. Look inside, said Mauricia. Inside the paper bag was a dead rat. Damon knew Mrs. Jules hated dead rats more than anything in the world. Put it in her desk, said Joy. If you don't, that means you love her, said Mauricia. I'm not in love with her, said Damon. Prove it, said Joy. Okay, I will, said Damon. The girls left. You don't have to put that dead rat in her desk, said DJ. We don't care, said Myron. You think I'm in love with her too, don't you? Asked Damon. Myron shrugged, and DJ smiled. Some friends you are, said Damon. I'll show you. After lunch, he was the first one back in class. He carried Joy's paper sack. Hello, Damon, said Mrs. Jules. Did you have a nice lunch? It was all right, he muttered. Oh, would you mind getting the construction paper from the closet and putting it on my desk? Asked Mrs. Jules. Thank you. Damon went to the closet and got the construction paper. He put it on her desk. Then, when she wasn't looking, he opened her desk drawer and dumped the dead rat into it, and he shut the drawer. Thank you, Damon, said Mrs. Jules. You're always so helpful. It's such a pleasure to have you in my class. Damon felt awful. Mrs. Jules read a story to the class. Damon couldn't pay attention. He kept wondering when she would open up her desk drawer. After the story, they had art. Everyone was supposed to make snowflakes. Damon folded his piece of paper of construction paper in half. All of a sudden, Mrs. Jules screamed. Ah! What's wrong, Mrs. Jules? Asked Joy. Somebody put a dead rat in my desk, said Mrs. Jules. I did, declared Damon. Damon, Mrs. Jules said with great surprise. Why? Because I can't stand you, Mrs. Jules, said Damon. You're always making me do things for you. Oh, I see, said Mrs. Jules. Should I write my name on the board under the word discipline? He asked. No, that won't be necessary, said Mrs. Jules. That made him feel even worse. Why did I have to prove myself to Joy, he wondered. I don't even like Joy. I like Mrs. Jules. Damon felt rotten. When the bell rang, Damon waited for all the other kids to leave. Then he walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. She was grading papers. Yes, Damon, said Mrs. Jules. Do you want me to erase the board for you? He asked. That's all right, said Mrs. Jules. I'll do it myself. Damon sadly walked out of the room and down the stairs. When he reached the bottom, he turned and ran all the way back up to Mrs. Jules' room. She was putting on her coat. I really do like you, Mrs. Jules, Damon declared. I'm sorry I put the dead rat in your desk. I did it because I didn't want everyone else to know that I really liked you. I'm sorry. I like you too, Damon, said Mrs. Jules. You do? What about Mr. Jules? Just because I love and like Mr. Jules doesn't mean I can't care for other people. She picked up her piece of chalk. If I give my piece of chalk to someone, then I wouldn't have any more. But when I give it to someone else that I care for, I end up having more. The more you have, the more you give away, the more you have left. Damon smiled. I really like you, Mrs. Jules, said Damon. He felt his heart fill up. He says, I really like you too, said Mrs. Jules. Well, this is getting disgusting, said the dead rat in her desk drawer. It climbed out of Mrs. Jules' desk and walked out the room. Chapter 7. What? It was purple. So Jenny read the story backward when she finished, and she threw up. Okay, said Jenny. So read the story backward, suggested Mrs. Jules. The beginning will be a surprise. But I already know how the story ends, Jenny complained. I only like stories with surprise endings. Good point, said Mrs. Jules. Here, you can read the story yourself. It's very funny. She gave the book to Jenny. All I heard was the last sentence, said Jenny. It isn't funny unless you know what happened first. Why aren't you laughing, Jenny? Asked Mrs. Jules. Didn't you think it was a funny story? That made Dana laugh even harder. There goes the giggle box, said Myron. Everybody laughed except for Jenny. Dana laughed hysterically. Mrs. Jules looked back at the story she had been reading before Jenny's interruption. There was only one sentence left for her to read. She read it to the class. Jenny made a face. She still could taste the awful stuff. And next time, you'll drink your prune juice more quickly, said Mrs. Jules. Jenny sat down. Mrs. Jules waited for Jenny to sit down. Jenny wrote her name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Well, that's no excuse, said Mrs. Jules. Now go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. I couldn't leave the table until I finished it, explained Jenny, and then I missed the bus. What does prune juice have to do with anything? Asked Mrs. Jules. Because I hate prune juice, Jenny griped. Why are you late? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you, said Jenny. I better take off my helmet. And she took off her helmet. Take off your helmet, said Mrs. Jules. What? Asked Jenny. Why are you so late? Asked Mrs. Jules. Jenny caught her breath. What? She asked. She couldn't hear too well because she was still wearing the motorcycle helmet. Mrs. Jules looked up from the story she had been reading to the class. You're late, she said. She hopped off the bike in front of Wayside School and charged up the stairs. Her stomach was still going up and down as she opened the door to Mrs. Jules' classroom. She put on her helmet, then her father drove her to school on the back of his motorcycle. It was a very bumpy ride. Put on your helmet, said her father. I'll drive you to school on the back of my motorcycle. I missed the bus, Jenny grumbled. What are you doing home? asked her mother. She finally got it all down, then hurried as fast as she could to the bus stop. When she got there, the bus was just pulling away. She sighed, then turned around and ran all the way back home. Her mother wouldn't let her leave the breakfast table until she finished her prune juice. It took her forever. She hated prune juice more than anything in the world. One day, Jenny was late for school. So if you're paying attention, I read the story from the end all the way back to the start of it. Have a great rest of the day. Next time we meet, Chapter 18, The Substitute.